What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. I would go ahead and do a video talking about another player who may not come up as often in the GOAT conversation, but by default, he kind of does. And I'll tell you why. Because, you know, a couple of years ago, especially, you know, as we were not too far from his actual career, I remember I used to encounter a lot Olajuwon fanboys, right? And they used to tell me why they thought that he was better than Kareem. So by default, if they're saying that he's better than Kareem, they're kind of saying, well, since Kareem is a GOAT candidate, then Olajuwon's a GOAT candidate. And especially if, look, if you're talking about a player's contributions on the court and you're not as focused on rings or overall team success, then Olajuwon does have a case. Now, let me say this first. What are some knocks against Olajuwon? Obviously, he only won two championships, right? But then again, so did Wilt. Wilt only won two championships. Um, One thing going for Wilt is that the 2 years he didn't win the title, 67 76ers, 72 Lakers, they're considered all-time great teams. Olajuwon did not have the benefit, for the most part, of playing with other Hall of Fame caliber players. For the most part, um, earlier in his career, he did play with Ralph Sampson, but I think after 3 years or so, injuries, 3 to 4 years, injuries ruined Ralph Sampson's career, what could have been a Hall of Fame career, and he was soon traded out of Houston. And Olajuwon didn't play with another Hall of Famer until Clyde Drexler, but by that time, this was, um, I think, 3 years after Drexler suffered that knee injury, which kind of robbed him of his athleticism and quickness. He still had some, but he wasn't the same player after that knee injury in 1992. And then Barkley wasn't the same player by the time he went to Houston. And Pippen was far from the same player when he played with Houston 1 year in '99. So, Hakeem didn't have the talent around him that other Hall of Famers were um, fortunate to have. But then again, another guy who didn't have Hall of Famers around him, maybe even less so, is Patrick Ewing. But people don't look at that with Ewing. You know what I'm saying? And Ewing probably had even less talent around him, pound for pound, than say um, Olajuwon. Another knock against Olajuwon is that when you look at his 18-year career, 9 times he either missed the playoffs or his team was ousted in the first round. That hurts you. Okay, that hurts you when it comes to the GOAT argument. Okay, I'm just putting out things that people will say. And then the two championships he did win, they largely came in an era where people say, well, Jordan wasn't really there. Now, technically Jordan was there in '95, but he wasn't really Jordan. Okay, so there's those are some of the knocks against Olajuwon. But these are some of the things that you have to keep into consideration. Okay? Number one, when it comes to his prime years, '80s and most of the 1990s, he stood head and shoulders above every other center in the NBA. Okay. Um, Now, while Kareem, and to a certain degree, Moses may have gotten more flowers in the '80s because of their accomplishments in the '70s and '80s. Pound for pound, Olajuwon was outplaying these guys. I think in the '86 playoffs, that series against the Lakers, against Kareem, Olajuwon averaged something like 31 points, 11 rebounds, 3 blocks, 2 steals, um, just filling it up against Olajuwon. And then, against Kareem. And then in the '86 playoffs, he was the only one that really showed up against Boston. You know, everybody else, you know, had a poor series. If he had any help in that series, perhaps, perhaps they could have beaten Boston. I can't remember how many points he averaged, but I want to say he averaged something like 34 points or something against Boston. He was killing them. But Ralph Sampson had a poor series, you know. In the '89 playoffs against the Sonics, I think it was, even though they lost in the first round, Olajuwon averaged something like 37 points, and maybe like 12 rebounds or something, 4 blocks, maybe 3 assists. And this is something that people have to remember about Hakeem Olajuwon. He had the second most unstoppable post move in the history of basketball, behind Kareem's skyhook. The dream shake is something that he had been working on since the '80s. He perfected it by the early to mid 1990s. You know, and it's kind of unfortunate that his peak came in a short time span. When I say his peak, to me, it's '93 to '96. By that time, he was already over 30 years old, but it was all coming together for him. Everything. Um, Everything came together for him, but it wasn't the biggest window. Remember, he was drafted. This is a guy, first of all, even before that, this is a guy that didn't start playing basketball until he was 15 or 16 years old. So he came late to the sport. Um, he took to it like a fish out of water. And when he was in college, this is a guy that was very, very competitive and wanted to improve his overall game. He was very interested in being the best he could. And because of that, he scrimmaged against adults. He scrimmaged against pros. He worked um, on his game during the NBA all season with Moses Malone, who at that time was a star with the Houston Rockets. And this really added to his game. And Olajuwon was, probably from what, maybe '81 to '84. I mean, he may have been the most dominant college player, or at least the second most dominant college player, other than Patrick Ewing. It's you know, I would say it's probably Pat overall, but Olajuwon made leaps and bounds the last couple of years. Olajuwon was drafted before Jordan, first overall pick. It was expected that the Twin Towers were going to be a championship contending team, but Ralph Sampson broke down earlier. And for a long period of time, it was Olajuwon playing on a bad team. Okay. And it got to a point where in the early '90s, it got so ridiculous that the head coach at the time, I think it was Don Chaney, had an offense where he was featuring the guards over Olajuwon. They were taking more shots. No disrespect to Vernon Maxwell or Kenny Smith, but the guards were taking more shots than Olajuwon. So Olajuwon was being marginalized, okay, offensively. The team was not a championship contending team. Um, Olajuwon is watching his counterpart Jordan win championships. And he's getting frustrated, and he wanted to be traded. Because at that time, he was nearing 30 years old. They fired Cheney, hired Rudy Tomjanovich, who was a very respected and loved Houston Rocket player, uh, and they changed the offense. They featured Olajuwon and had built a team specifically to be successful around his skill and his game. And Olajuwon finally was able to display what his game had evolved to by the mid 1990s. And let's remember, Olajuwon was playing against a lot of great centers. Okay, in the 80s, Kareem, of course, Moses, uh, Robert Parrish, Jack Sikma, um, Patrick Ewing, of course. Later on, David Robinson. Um, maybe some guys who aren't in the Hall of Fame, but were still really good. Whether you're talking about Bill Laimbeer or Brad Doherty or Joe Barry Carroll, um, Mark Eaton. Even though he wasn't a scorer per se, but he was a dominant defensive presence. Um, even I don't even throw him a new bowl. You know, not a Hall of Famer, but shit. I mean, when you have the highest blocks to minutes played ratio in NBA history, you're something, right? The guy was the most prodigious shot blocker we've ever seen um, when it comes to blocks per minute. Then in the 90s, Shaq, Mourning, the list goes on and on. Rick Smits, you know, all of these great big men, and Olajuwon, Marcus Camby, uh, you know, other ones will pop in my head. But Olajuwon stood head and shoulders above all of these guys. And he not only stood his own in series against these guys, he dominated them, often embarrassingly. He dominated them. Whether you're talking about the 94 finals when Olajuwon averaged something like, what was he averaging? 27 points, almost 10 rebounds, maybe 3 assists, 3 blocks, held Ewing to 36% shooting, only 18 points a game. Um, I mean, he was phenomenal. First of all, I could just go through different series. David Robinson, I think he averaged like 30, 35, 13 rebounds, uh, 4 blocks, 3 steals. I mean, it's just so many things I could mention. Um, First of all, he is the greatest post scorer in the history of the NBA. He and Kevin McHale. But even with Kevin McHale's prodigious and prolific post game was sort of limited more to the low post, whereas Olajuwon could give it to you in the high post as well as the low post, and he had range outside to probably about 19 to 20 feet consistently. And when he got hot, he could even, on occasion, step behind the arc and knock down a three when that was not standard for an NBA center. So offensively, Olajuwon had a complete arsenal. You know, I mean, people kind of forget the type of game he had in that era compared to other centers. It was quite phenomenal. I mean, it really wasn't anybody touching this guy until like he started deteriorating maybe in the late 90s. But not only that, you have to wonder what Olajuwon could have done had he been featured offensively his entire career the way that he was in the mid 90s. Remember, in the mid 90s, that's when he finally was averaging 27, 28 points a game, Before that, he was sharing the rock with Ralph Sampson, or it was other guys in the backcourt averaging 20 some points a game, when in reality they should have been averaging 12, 13, while Olajuwon was only averaging 21 or 22 when he should have been averaging close to 30. So when you look at the fact that he had almost 27,000 points, Olajuwon really should have had over 30,000 points. Then you look at his versatility as a defender. There's no other center that I can think of in the modern era since the '70s, since they've been tracking these numbers. Now you can make a case for Bill Russell and Will Chamberlain, but we're guessing and we don't quite know the numbers. But in the '70s and onward, right? Name me another center other than maybe David Robinson on some level before the leg injury that could potentially lead the NBA in both blocks and steals. Nobody else was doing that. Really, not even David. David might have had some seasons where he was averaging, 3.5, 4 blocks, but maybe 1.5 steals. But Olajuwon was literally sometimes flirting with the NBA lead in steals. Like, it was crazy. I would look at blocks, Olajuwon, okay? Rebounds, Olajuwon, leaders. Steals, they'll say Jordan, Stockton, maybe Alvin Robinson, you know, Pippen. And then you see Olajuwon, like, what the fuck is he doing on this list? There was one season where Olajuwon had combined over 600 blocks and steals. No one in the history of the NBA has achieved that. Nobody. No one. Other than him. He's the official all-time blocks leader at 3,830. And he's still in the top 10 in career steals. A center. The only one on that list. A post player. Now, most of his steals came from, you know, uh, the fact that most of his steals came from the fact that he had very quick hands and he could strip big men. But he also would, on occasion, creep from behind and get steals, or errant passes, in the passing lane. He was a crazy defensive player, with a very, very, very high IQ when it came to the game. Um, what else do I want to say about this guy? He's probably the most dominant defensive player overall that the game has seen since Bill Russell. I mean, nobody really comes close to him. On the perimeter, Jordan, yes. But Olajuwon, the way that he could affect the game on so many levels, not only, like I said, in the post defensively, but he had the quickness when he was in his prime to even affect play on the perimeter. I'll give you an example I'm talking about. The way that he was able to come out and block John Stark's shot, in the '94 finals in game 6. Most other centers would not have been able to do that. And think about it. I still have this strong feeling. I talked to a Knicks fan to this day. I have a really strong feeling that John Starks was going to make that goddamn shot because he was going. He was really hot, uh, during that game. I have a feeling that that shot was going to go in. But Olajuwon could have potentially saved a championship. Well, take away a championship from the New York Knicks. But that's what I'm talking about with his speed and quickness and his ability to affect uh, the offense, the opposing team's offense from the pivot. But he wasn't just your traditional, Andre Drummond type guy. He could go out and challenge. That's very reminiscent of a guy like Bill Russell. when you look at a guy who's considered the most dominant, a guy that calls himself the most dominant, like Shaq, and I made this point before. Um, Shaq never led the league in rebounding. Olajuwon did, I think, on multiple occasions. Olajuwon's led the NBA in blocks on multiple occasions. Shaq never did that. So for a guy like him, Olajuwon, to do what he did, okay, um, at being 6 foot 10 and a half, even though he's listed at 7 feet, and when he was, you know, at his prime in the mid 90s, he was actually down to 235. Now he usually played at 255, but um, at that time he had lost a lot of weight. He was down to 235, and that's why Olajuwon looked so spectacular in the mid 90s because he had lost 20 pounds um, from when he was younger. Now he did go on to regain that weight by the late 90s, but yeah, Olajuwon was just simply a phenomenal center. He showed that finesse and skill will beat brute force every time. But you know, you talk about the 51% field goal percentage, 52% field goal percentage. He was a pretty good foul shooter at 71%. Um, he wasn't the best foul shooter, but he was pretty good. Um, and also when you consider the fact that he played on teams that had pretty good point guard play, whether you're talking about Sam Cassell or Kenny Smith. I'm not saying Hall of Famers, but pretty good point guard play, pretty good guard play in general, right? The fact that he was able to average over 3 assists per game, I think for his career is 2.5 assists, but in his prime he averaged around 3 to 3.5 assists per game. The fact that he was able to do that on a bad team showcases his versatility, especially in that era when you didn't really have bigs doing that. The only bigs that were really averaging that many assists were probably guys like Kareem did it in certain years, but maybe only Bill Walton. That's not something you normally saw in a big at that time, not in the NBA. Of course, Arvidas Sabonis was doing it, but he wasn't in the NBA until the late 90s or mid 90s. And then there's the thing, the comparison that you have to mention, the comparison between he and Michael Jordan. This much I do know. During the early 90s, the three-peat years, the first three-peat, the Bulls' record against the Houston Rockets was terrible. I think it was something like, I want to say one in 9 or 1 in 7. It was terrible. I do know that. I know from 90 to 93 or something like that. They were like let's just say 1 in 7. They did not play well against Olajuwon. Olajuwon usually dominated the Chicago front line, which begs the question: were the Bulls fortunate to have always played a team in the finals without that dominant Hall of Fame caliber big man? I mean, you think about it. In '91, their center was Vlade, who is in the Hall of Fame, but I mean, you know what I'm trying to say. He's more in the Hall of Fame because of international play. You know, he was a solid big man, but he doesn't really rank amongst the creme de la creme of big men. Then in '92, I think their big man was Kevin Duckworth. He's solid, but he wasn't '93, Oliver Miller. Enough said. '96, Irvin Johnson. Not Magic, the other Irvin Johnson. '97 and '98, Greg Ostertag. Womp, womp, womp. So you know what I'm saying? It's something to be said about that. There's something to be said about that. And when you consider the fact that the Bulls did have some trouble with the Knicks because of Patrick Ewing, but Ewing never had another Hall of Famer with him, it does make you wonder if the Bulls did benefit from certain matchup advantages. So that's the case for Hakeem Olajuwon, man. I mean, he is the most skilled big man ever, and you can even make a case that he's the most skilled basketball player ever, even more so than Kobe, because you really can't think of another guy like him. You know what I'm saying? He had no weaknesses for a big man. Now you could sit there and say, well, by today's standards, he couldn't shoot threes, but nobody holds it against him because guys, big men weren't shooting threes back then. And there's nothing about his game and the way that it evolved that tells me that he probably couldn't become a good three-point shooter. This is a guy that started off as a power player in college, mostly just scoring in the paint. All right. And then by the time he's in his late 20s, he's developing a mid-range jumper. By the peak years, his range is out to 20 feet. There's no, I have no qualms or trepidations in saying that, you know, I think in today's era, he would probably be a really good three-point shooting big man. In addition to the ball handling ability that he displayed, you didn't see centers handling the ball like that going one-on-one against guards. It was embarrassing sometimes the way Olajuwon was doing people. But he didn't really have any weaknesses. He was a great high post scorer, a great low post scorer. He had a great mid range game. He was a tremendous offensive and defensive rebounder, a tremendous shot blocker. Defensively, you know, he was unbelievable. He get the passing lane for steals. Um, you know, high basketball IQ, great scorer, efficient. Um, you know, he could play the finesse game. At times, he could still go back to the power game. Um, he was a pretty good foul shooter for a big man. I mean, you know, he's one of the few players to get a quadruple double. He's the closest, other than Wilt, to get a quintuple double. You know, he has a hell of a case, other than the things I mentioned that hurt him, you know, early in the video. But what do you guys think?